Another Senate hearing is set to be held next week, featuring witnesses from the Departments of Defense and Homeland Security and the FBI.
Now, can he ever play golf again? That is the question amongst his fans, as one of the world's sporting greats, Tiger Woods, is in hospital having sustained serious injuries to both his legs in a car accident. His surgeon has just said that Woods had particularly multiple open fractures to his lower right leg. A rod has been placed in his tibia with screws and pins in his ankle. Well, let's have the latest from Jean-Amir Jamin.
A mangled SUV lays motionless on its side, right by this Los Angeles roadway on Tuesday. This was the scene where just hours earlier, golfing legend Tiger Woods lost control of his car, crashing into the thicket below. For a brief moment, the golf world waited with bated breath, worried that Woods might be critically injured or worse.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sick to my stomach. You know, it hurts to see one of your, now my closest friends, you know, get in an accident, and man, I just hope he's all right. Just worry for his kids, you know, I'm sure they're struggling.
But when the sheriff's deputy poked his head through the windshield and asked for his name, a lucid response of Tiger could be heard. He had survived the worst.
So I will say that it's very fortunate that Mr. Woods was able to come out of this alive. The nature of his vehicle, the fact that he was wearing a seatbelt, I would say that it greatly increased the likelihood that it saved his life.
The gravity of the impact was, however, immediately evident. The 15-time major championship winner had severely injured both legs and was rushed off to surgery. A flood of reactions followed, with the likes of Mike Tyson, Jack Nicklaus, and former President Donald Trump wishing a speedy recovery to the man largely considered the greatest golfer ever. Despite surviving the crash, the obvious question for fans now is if Woods will ever be able to play golf again. But the preeminent player of his generation has shown resilience to come back before, emerging through a cycle of injuries, self-inflicted personal problems and a DUI arrest. Each and every time, he has returned to the course and won.
Let's bring you some more world news now on the programme. And leading technology companies have told Congress that a months-long breach of corporate and government networks at the end of last year was so sophisticated, focused and labour-intensive that a nation had to be behind it, with all the evidence pointing to Russia. Representatives of technology companies involved in the response describing a hack of almost breathtaking precision, ambition and scope. At least 9 government agencies and 100 private companies were breached. Police officers who put a hood over the head of a mentally distraught black man, then pressed his body against the pavement until he stopped breathing, will not face criminal charges. That after a US grand jury declined to indict them. Daniel Prude died last March, several days after his encounter with the police in Rochester, New York. The Attorney General saying her office presented the strongest case possible to the grand jury, but couldn't persuade it that the officers had actually committed a crime. And at least 75 inmates have died in riots at prisons in 3 separate cities in Ecuador as a result of fights between rival gangs and an escape attempt. Hundreds of officers from tactical units had been deployed since the clashes broke out late Monday. 2 groups trying to gain criminal leadership within the detention centres blamed for the violence. The clashes precipitated, though, by a search for weapons by police officers. Now, despite being amongst the world's most technologically advanced nations, South Korea is receiving its first vaccines today against coronavirus. With the first inoculations, they're due, in fact, on Friday. The country, one of the first hit, you'll remember, by the pandemic, but it soon became rather a role model for mass testing and aggressive contact tracing measures. South Korea's Prime Minister saying herd immunity there should be achieved by the autumn. Well, we're going to cross then to Seoul, speak to our correspondent Bruce Harrison, who joins us from there. Bruce, I suppose the obvious question is just why this has taken so long.
Stuart, the South Korean government here has never indicated that it's late in beginning its vaccination program for this country. They've said for months now that they want to wait and see how other populations in other countries react to these various vaccines that are now available to see if it's safe. Apparently now they do feel confident that South Koreans should receive these vaccines. They are safe, and they will begin from Friday, the first jab here for healthcare workers. It's the AstraZeneca vaccine. That being said, there are a lot of critics of the health ministry in Seoul here for not pushing this along more quickly, despite other quick efforts in South Korea. Some say they were slow to secure contracts to get these vaccines, and that ultimately their goals, like you mentioned, of herd immunity are going to be very challenging because the bulk of the supply to vaccinate this population isn't here yet and may not arrive in the first half of the year.
Yeah, you mentioned that herd immunity. I mean, the Prime Minister saying it should be achieved by the autumn. I mean, that sounds quite optimistic.
It's really optimistic, Stuart, and they haven't come out and said that this is a 100% sure thing. That's their hope, to have 70% of the population inoculated by the end of September to achieve herd immunity. That's going to come down to a couple of things, though. The government can only do so much. Yes, it's been very speedy in its testing and other healthcare measures, and they are prepared to vaccinate people. But like I said, supply. Those vaccines haven't arrived here yet, and it's unclear if they will arrive in the numbers expected in time. Because if they do get here in July, that still gives healthcare workers just a couple of months to vaccinate people. And recent polls here, Stuart, also show that less than half of the population of this country is willing to get a vaccine right now. There's concerns about the safety of these vaccines, as we're seeing in other nations around the world as well. So it's going to require the public, as well as the government's efforts, to make that 70% goal by the end of September possible. But it's a tall order.
Bruce, thanks very much. Bruce Harrison, correspondent, talking to us there from Seoul. Now, Niger's ruling party candidate Mohamed Bazoum has been declared the winner of the country's presidential election, with the results set to usher in Niger's first transition from one democratically elected leader to another. That is, his opponent alleged fraud, and opposition supporters burned tyres in the streets. Bazoum winning 55.75% of the vote in the weekend's elections. Provisional results are set to be confirmed by the Constitutional Court. But who is he then? Well, Shirley Sitbon reports.
This was one of the key moments in Mohamed Bazoum's rise to power. In 2019, he became the ruling party's candidate for the presidential election. Him and not Mahamadou Issoufou, the sitting president, who was about to complete his second term and couldn't run again. This transition was a first.
Je ne me suis jamais imaginé porter un jour le lourd fardeau dont vous venez de me poser la charge.
Originally a philosophy professor, Bazoum turned to politics, founding with Mahamadou Issoufou what is now the ruling party, the Nigerian Party for Democracy and Socialism. For 3 decades, they were political allies. Throughout Issoufou's mandates, Bazoum held major portfolios, serving as foreign minister and home secretary. The opposition says that under the ruling party, people's rights to protest were violated. On these images, people who demonstrated against economic reforms were waiting to be tried. Although his rise to power is a transition, Bazoum plans to stick to the policies of his predecessor. Among his main challenges, the economy. 40% of Niger's residents live in extreme poverty.
Malheureusement, je l'ai dit, les recettes n'auront pas de résultats immédiats.
As the president-elect is set to take office, Niger still struggles with insecurity on 2 separate fronts. On its western border with Mali and Burkina Faso, where jihadists linked to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State group are active. And in the southeast, where Boko Haram has attacked soldiers and civilians.
Shirley Sitbon there with that report. Now then, imagine you're in a bar, pretty rare, or actually impossible for many of us at the moment. You're sitting there and your drinks arrive, not though bought by a human, but instead a robot. Let's have a look at these drinkers in Seville in Spain, enjoying table service at bars and restaurants by new technology which is entering the market to help prevent the spread of COVID-19. It's slightly creepy, this one, isn't it? I don't know why, I find it slightly weird, but man's best friend, he or she, is called a Spot, apparently, fetching you a glass of beer. And it's not just serving drinks, also pouring them. These are the very latest bartenders as well. The idea to minimise contact and maintain virus safety measures. Well, it would certainly do that. Just hope they don't spill it. Needs to be very even, doesn't it? Main headlines on today's Live from Paris, if you're just tuning into the programme today. A multi-ethnic rally being held in Myanmar today. It's a real worry for those who led the military coup that the country's ethnic groups are coming together to stand against them. A first bilateral meeting between the new US President Joe Biden and Canada's Justin Trudeau, virtually, of course, as Trudeau says US leadership has been sorely missed over the past years. And fans of the golfing superstar Tiger Woods asking if he'll ever play again after he sustained serious injuries to both legs in a car crash. Business news now then on the programme. Asian markets suffering fresh losses really as concerns about rising inflation continue to sap confidence. Investors rather unmoved by reassurances in the US from the Federal Reserve boss Jerome Powell that officials will maintain record low interest rates for as long as needed. As you can see there are steep drops across the board. Well, earlier we spoke to Han Tan. He's market analyst with FXTM, and it was put to him that inflation fears are still pretty high in Asia.
What we're seeing right now is that markets are still rather skeptical despite Fed Chair Jerome Powell's comments that we heard yesterday saying that the U.S. economy is still a long way from a full recovery and that inflation not reaching troubling levels, right? But I think it remains to be seen how long markets can keep up this narrative. Sure, yields have been climbing higher, but what we certainly do have central bankers around the world. I'm talking about the Fed, the ECB, even the Bank of Korea, RBA, etc. They are all paying close attention to these rising yields because these yields, if it reaches a certain level, could really curtail their respective governments' ability to finance their respective recoveries. So again, it's a battle of push and pull between what the markets think and versus how well the Fed can dampen such talk before we see yields really reach a painful threshold for stocks beyond the declines we have already seen of late.
Hand out there from FXTM. Now, French alpine ski resorts in the Haute-Savoie region may be deprived of downhill skiing this season due to the ongoing lift closures. But there are plenty of alternative activities on offer in a bid to keep tourism going despite the pandemic. Let's find out then in this report from Marios Sophos.
In an attempt to recoup some of their losses, ski resorts in the southeastern French region of Haute-Savoie are going out of their way to offer different activities to visitors, with all downhill skiing still prevented by lift closures. Amongst a number of options on offer, there's cross-country skiing, sledging and even shooting.
On a une quarantaine d'années, donc le ski descendre, ravaler de la piste, ça on a fait depuis des années. Et du coup, je trouve ça vraiment sympa de pouvoir découvrir d'autres sports et d'autres façons de vivre la montagne.
For instructors, it's provided a welcome opportunity to keep doing what they do best, despite the significant loss of work they've experienced.
Forcément, c'est pas une saison qui est normale, mais grâce à ce côté ski de fond biathlon, on arrive à faire bosser quand même les gens comme il faut.
It was here in Contamine-Montjoie that France's first COVID-19 cluster was detected back in February 2020. The reservation rate in the Haute-Savoie region has plummeted to 37% compared to the usual 80 to 90% in previous years.
Même si on a une fréquentation qui est correcte, qui est loin d'être catastrophique, on n'a pas la fréquentation telle qu'on l'avait il y a 2 ans à hauteur d'un taux de réservation de 81% sur les stations de Savoie-Mont-Blanc. Donc les chiffres et les données sont loin d'être comparables.
Haute-Savoie is projected to suffer losses of €6 billion for the current ski season.
Marios Sophos reporting for you. Going to take you to Malta now here on the programme. That's at the start of the press review today. A major development in the investigation into the murder of a prominent investigative journalist who was killed several years ago, Alison.
Yeah, this is Daphne Caruana Galizia. Some of you might remember she was killed in a car bombing back in 2017. One of the men accused of planting that bomb pleaded guilty on Tuesday. The Times of Malta calls this a momentous turning point in the case because up until yesterday, this man had been denying the charges. His name is Vincent Muscat. He's also known as Il Kohu. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison after making a plea deal to give information to Maltese authorities. And in another development on Tuesday, 3 other men who were suspected of providing this bomb were arrested. Now, the Malta Independent, where Daphne Caruana Galizia was a regular contributor, printed the statement that was read in court by her family. They expressed hope that this is the start of complete complete justice for the slain journalist. And it is just the start, Stuart, because it's not yet clear who exactly ordered her killing. When she was killed, Caruana Galizia was investigating high-level corruption in Malta's business and political elite. And a businessman, Jorgen Fennick, is accused of being the mastermind, and he is currently in custody, although he does deny the charges.
Let's move to some shocking revelations published in The Guardian. This is about deaths of thousands of migrant workers building World Cup stadiums in Qatar.
That's right. The Guardian found that over 6,500 migrant workers have died in Qatar since the country was chosen to host the 2022 World Cup 10 years ago. That means 12 workers have been dying each week since December of 2010. The paper writes that this shocking figure is likely to be an underestimate because it concerns workers coming from India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, but not the Philippines or Kenya, which also make up a big part of the workforce. The Guardian didn't have access to those figures. The paper connects these deaths to Qatar's unprecedented World Cup building plan, which involves 7 stadiums and dozens of major projects, such as an airport and even a brand new city that's being built to host the final.
And you found articles from other papers as well, haven't you, reacting to these revelations with indignation.
Yeah, French sports magazine SoFoot tweeted their article about these revelations, saying that the 2022 World Cup will be played on a cemetery. They note the denial of the Qatari government, which claimed that the mortality rate of the migrant workers is, quote, in line with expectations for that demographic. The magazine also calls out FIFA for their denial. They insisted that all the construction sites do abide by strict safety measures. SoFoot, though, is not buying it. They characterize both of these responses as move along and nothing to see here. Meanwhile, the London-based paper Al Arab writes, when the games begin in Qatar in November 2022, some will celebrate the most popular event on the planet. Others will feel grief faced with the death of the workers who died, and still others, they write, will feel anger and call for justice for these victims, most of whom, the paper says, came from South Asian countries, just hoping to make money for their families so that they could survive.
It is an incredible number of people who've lost their lives, isn't it? Now, the next story is also out of Qatar. This is the television station Al Jazeera planning to launch a new news platform, but it's actually targeting Americans' conservatives.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like their usual audience, does it, Stuart? This new platform is going to be called Rightly. In a statement to the Middle East Eye, Al Jazeera said that they aim to reach Republicans on the center-right who are, quote, currently underrepresented in today's media. This project is being run by a former Fox News journalist named Scott Norvell, and it will launch its first interview show on Thursday. But many journalists at Al Jazeera who are very critical of this new venture, and they spoke to the Middle East Eye anonymously. One said they couldn't see how it fit in with Al Jazeera's other platforms, and they said it feels more like a PR stunt than an actual journalistic effort. And then another one said that they really worry that it could amplify racist views. There's also concern that it could sort of change ideas about Al Jazeera being more neutral. So it's going to be interesting to see how this is received in the United States.
To watch, as they say. Let's come to France for a quick word about the news that the actor Gérard Depardieu has been charged in December, in fact, with rape and sexual assault.
That's right, Stuart. He was charged in December, but these charges just came out to the public yesterday. This story is getting a lot of attention outside of France since Gérard Depardieu is such an iconic French actor. A French magazine, the Courrier International, has done sort of a roundup of reactions from Germany. The press there sees this really as just the latest in a wave of revelations we've been seeing in France of rape, but also incest and child sex abuse. The Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung writes, not a day goes by without a new accusation, a new scandal, a new outrage. And the paper concludes something has changed in France since Dominique Strauss-Kahn and since the Me Too movement.
Certainly has. Now we're going to end in Canada for this next story. In recent months, Canadians have been rather baffled by the fact that their butter apparently no longer melts at room temperature.
That's right, sir. This is a curious story. This mystery in Canada has been dubbed Buttergate. It began when Canadians, thousands of Canadians, started sharing on social media their observations about this change in their butter. They said it was harder, wasn't melting at room temperature, making it impossible to spread. As we read on the website of Canadian TV station CTV, some agricultural scientists say that it's caused by farmers giving palm oil supplements to their cows to boost production production, because apparently there's been more need for production for butter since COVID-19. More people are staying home and using butter to cook, I think is the idea.
Yeah.
Anyway, the palm oil then increases the amount of saturated fat in the butter, which in turn raises the melting point. It is perfectly legal, the website points out, to give palm oil to cows, but this agricultural scientist is really concerned that it's going to erode trust between Canadians and dairy farmers. And they note that dairy farming and milk and dairy products in general do have a very special place in Canada.
Interesting to know what it's all about. There you go. You see Alison Sargent spreading the news across the world for us. Doing my best. Alison Sargent there with the paper. She'll be back, of course, set in a couple of hours' time. Next half hour, we're going to be reporting on a new approach by French animal welfare organisations to try to stop poachers targeting lynx and even bears. They're offering people up to €50,000 to provide information to catch people. But how is it actually going down with local people? That's our focus report in the next half an hour.
It's a concept that's central to life here in France, yet it's controversial and often misunderstood.
We're talking about laïcité, France's special brand of secularism, the separation of church and state.
Its backers say it's the glue that keeps the French together despite their differences. Its critics say it's anti-religious and increasingly used to stigmatize Muslims.
People have different conceptions, views about laicity. The big debate is about neutrality, guaranteeing everybody is treated equally. How can you give enough freedom without this freedom being dangerous for democracy?
So is laïcité compatible with a modern multicultural society? Join us for this episode of French Connections Plus.
French Connections Plus, presented by Jeannie Godula and Florence Villemino.
The world is ever-changing. The news doesn't wait. That's why at France 24, we'll always be there to help make sense of world events. For the best international coverage, 24 hours a day, no matter what. France 24, with you everywhere, all the time. Liberté, égalité, actualité.
Welcome back. Good to have you with us. We're live from Paris on France 24. The headlines today. A first bilateral meeting between the new US President Joe Biden and Canada's Justin Trudeau, virtually, of course, as Trudeau says US leadership has been sorely missed over the past years. Fans of the golfing superstar Tiger Woods asking if he'll ever play again after a serious car crash. In the last hour or so, his surgeon saying he had multiple open fractures to his lower right leg. And demonstrators setting up tents outside Georgia's Parliament building and blocking the capital's main avenue to protest the arrest of the leader of the country's main opposition party. I'm going to be discussing the latest with Doug Herbert in Global Grid in 15 minutes' time. Glad you could be with us then. We are live from Paris. I'm Stuart Norval. The headlines also coming up for you. How do you empower women and girls? Well, perhaps through sport. Basketball is the favourite here. It's a new academy in Iraqi Kurdistan. So one man, Joe Biden, in the Roosevelt Room at the White House. The other, Justin Trudeau, in the Prime Minister's office in Ottawa. The first bilateral meeting then between the two men, virtually, of course, since Joe Biden took office. High on policy, less high on the usual pomp. Biden saying the United States has no closer friend than Canada. Trudeau commending Biden for quickly rejoining the Paris Climate Accord. As he said, US leadership has been sorely missed over the past years. Erin Agunke reports.
Behind masks and in separate conference rooms, there was little pomp and ceremony for Joe Biden's virtual conference with Justin Trudeau, the U.S. president's first meeting with a foreign leader since taking office. On the agenda, solidifying a united front to tackle shared challenges, including climate change, continental security, relations with China, and the coronavirus pandemic.
Job one remains keeping people safe and ending this pandemic. This afternoon, the President and I discussed collaboration to beat COVID-19, from keeping key supplies moving and supporting science and research to joint efforts through international institutions. We're standing united in this fight.
After 4 years of tension under Donald Trump, both leaders hailed a return to normal relations between the historically close allies. In one of the biggest breaks with the Trump administration, Biden and Trudeau announced a closer alliance to combat climate change now that the United States has rejoined the Paris Climate Agreement.
To that end, we're launching a high-level climate ambition ministerial, and to align our policies and our goals, and to achieve net zero emissions by 2050.
President Biden also pushed for closer cooperation with Canada in order to better counter Beijing, with the U.S. president reiterating calls for Chinese authorities to free 2 Canadians detained there. And with both leaders emphasizing reinvigorated relations between the two countries, they avoided mentioning any points of tension. Among them, Joe Biden's promise to block the Keystone XL pipeline, which would have transported crude oil from Canada to the United States.
Now, missed intelligence, that being blamed by the outmanned defenders of the US Capitol as they failed to anticipate the violent mob that invaded the iconic building at the start of January. Those in charge of security that day, in the first public testimony on the insurrection, the officials pointing their fingers at various federal agencies and each other for their failure to defend the building. The former Capitol police chief saying he did not see an FBI report that warned of online posts about a war.
Reviewed it and then forwarded over to an official at the intelligence division over at U.S. Capitol Police Headquarters.
And so you hadn't seen it yourself?
No, ma'am. It did not go any further than that.
Can he ever play golf again? That's the question amongst his fans as one of the world's sporting greats. Tiger Woods is in hospital, having sustained serious injuries to both his legs in a car accident. His surgeon has just been saying in the last hour or so that Woods had multiple open fractures to his lower right leg, and a rod has been placed in his tibia with screws and pins in his ankle. Police are shocked by the seriousness of the accident. Let's hear, in fact, from the first officer on the scene.
I asked him what his name was. He told me his name was Tiger, and at that moment I immediately recognized him. I asked him if he knew where he was, what time of day, just to make sure he was oriented. I will say that it's very fortunate that Mr. Woods was able to come out of this alive. The nature of his vehicle, the fact that he was wearing a seatbelt, I would say that it greatly increased the likelihood that it saved his life.
Now, Senegal has launched its COVID-19 vaccination campaign in the capital Dakar, where the health minister received the first jab of China's Sinopharm vaccine. This day is an historic day, he said. The West African nation has received 200,000 doses, with them going to healthcare workers and people over 60. Well, from Dakar, for France 24, Sarah Sacco with Emmanuel Landé have this report.
This is the very first injection of the Sinopharm vaccine in Senegal against COVID-19. Abdoulaye Diouf Sarr, the Minister of Health, was the first to be vaccinated in public. Several other well-known figures from at-risk groups were keen to set an example and be amongst the first to be vaccinated. Ndeye Fatou Diallo is the president of the Association of Badiane Gox, a group of reproductive health counsellors.
Nous avons une grande entité derrière nous, donc nous allons donner de bonnes leçons en se faisant vacciner pour que les autres Badianes puissent se vacciner et faire la sensibilisation au niveau de leur localité.
The first batch of 200,000 doses of the Chinese vaccine are intended for frontline health workers, Senegalese over 60 years old, and those living with pre-existing severe health conditions. For many healthcare workers like Marine Ndiaye, it's a huge relief. The second wave of coronavirus in Senegal has been deadlier than the first.
Nous sommes en pied d'œuvre tous les jours et nous espérons que d'ici peu, vraiment, ça va réduire et que nous aussi, que nous puissions vraiment continuer les autres programmes de santé parce qu'il n'y a pas seulement le Covid.
Senegal is expecting nearly 7 million doses in the coming weeks. Authorities are keen to get the ball rolling.
Nous sommes aujourd'hui en train de finaliser notre relation commerciale pour faire venir du Sputnik V le plus rapidement possible dans les jours qui viennent. Mais aussi, dans le cadre de l'initiative COVAX, le Sénégal va recevoir sa première dotation qui équivaut à 1 300 000 doses. Et nous n'allons pas nous en arrêter là.
Without making the vaccine mandatory, another challenge for the government is dealing with people reluctant to be vaccinated.
Now, 2 Australian states are to loosen restrictions on dancing at indoor venues and ease other curbs from Friday after several weeks of no COVID-19 cases. In New South Wales, up to 30 people will be allowed to dance at weddings, and as many as 30 will also be able to sing indoors together. Households will also be allowed to host 50 guests. Restrictions also being eased in South Australia, with dancing there also allowed in smaller venues. Now, for fans of French rugby, well, it really is the worst news. The team had been tipped for the top potential favourites to win the Six Nations tournament for the first time since 2010. That was before COVID struck. 10 French players, as well as several members of staff, including the coach, returning positive COVID tests. Today, a final decision set to be made as to whether the match this weekend against Scotland can go ahead or not. Peter O'Brien reports.
It was meant to be a secure bubble, safe from all contamination, with limited interaction with the outside world, PCR tests 3 times a week and mandatory masks. But the bubble got a leak, and within 2 weeks more than a dozen players and backroom staff for France's rugby union team have tested positive for the coronavirus. Head coach Fabien Galtier got his positive test result on the 15th of February. The day after their match in Dublin against Ireland.
Les premiers cas positifs ont été décelés lundi, avec donc une possibilité de contamination dans les 48 heures avant ce test-là, et ça inclut le jour du match et le jour du transfert entre Dublin et Paris, et donc des jours où il y avait énormément d'interactions, donc il y a eu une grande dissémination du virus.
3 days earlier, the team trained with the separate Rugby 7 squad. The French Rugby Federation suspects this may have been the origin of the cluster in the Six Nations squad. A decision will soon be made on whether the match against Scotland this weekend will go ahead. The latest tests have revealed no new cases.
Now, how to tackle period poverty. That's the inability, of course, to pay for menstrual protection. Well, here in France, the government has announced it is to make period products actually free for students, with free tampons and sanitary towels to be installed in student residences and university health services. James Vassina explains.
Ending period poverty among students once and for all.
It's a mission now officially taken up by the French government. Speaking to undergrads in Poitiers in western France, Higher Education Minister Frédéric Vidal said the programme will be rolled out in the weeks to come.
We will set up machines with entirely free menstrual products in hallways, in student accommodation, and universities' health services.
1,500 machines will be up and running by the start of the next academic year in September. This after several studies found that 1/3 of students struggled to afford period products, while student poverty has soared amid the pandemic. The announcement was a welcome move for those attending the speech.
I can only welcome these measures. They're long overdue. Plenty of students are facing poverty and don't have the means to pay for what is an essential need.
Let's just say there's a start to everything. It's better than nothing. As a student and as a woman, I'm concerned by this, but it would be good if it was extended to all women who are struggling to make ends meet.
France is slowly following in Scotland's footsteps, the first country in the world to make period products free to all women back in November. England and New Zealand have also implemented similar schemes in schools, as many across the world fight to end the period taboo.
And how further to empower women and girls? Well, perhaps through sport. That's the goal of an academy in Iraqi Kurdistan. 5 years after opening its doors, there are now more than 100 girls enrolled in various sports there. What is the most popular, though? In fact, it is basketball. Claire Rush reports.
She shoots, she scores. Running, dribbling, sinking layups. These actions may seem commonplace for these girls in Iraqi Kurdistan, but that wasn't always the case.
لسالانی رابطوها لوانه چند تاراتیک رگریان لکراب بورزش کدوم براستی بلام لیسه خوشبختانه اما کو رخراوی جیما لچوار پنسالی رابطوها او مدل مانگوری براستی لیسه اما رخرا کمان تایبت به ورزشی کشان لیسه این رخرا کمان ورزش کن دور به آزادانه لیره.
Women's sports are more prevalent in Iraq's autonomous Kurdistan region compared to the rest of the country. Established in 2016, the academy provides space, equipment, and training for girls wishing to play at amateur and professional levels. For the 120 girls enrolled here, the center has changed their lives for the better.
سال ليرم هست سال بزن خوشنیش سال جیانم با و عائله کم زور هاوکاریم بون هست کم هیچ رگیرگ نبوده بردم و هست کم که رفقانی که کسانی که لیرنین هست کم یعنی بشی زور گرینگی جنیان ندسیا.
Organizers hope their empowering safe space will encourage even more girls to take a shot and try their hand at sports.
They look pretty good at it as well, don't they? Nice and coordinated there. Main headlines on Live from Paris. A first bilateral meeting between the new US President Joe Biden and Canada's Justin Trudeau. Virtually, of course, as Trudeau says US leadership has been sorely missed over the past years. And fans of the golfing superstar Tiger Woods asking if he'll ever play again. He sustained serious injuries to both legs in a car crash. Now, demonstrators have set up tents outside Georgia's Parliament building and blocked the capital's main avenue to protest the arrest of the leader of the country's main opposition party. The demonstration hours after police stormed the headquarters of the United National Movement and arrested its chairman, lawmaker Nika Melia. Around 20 other people also said to have been arrested at the party's headquarters. Well, let's hear, first of all, from some of the demonstrators.
ვადამდელი არჩევნები და პოლიტპატიმრების განთავისუფლება. ეს არის ორი უპირობო პირობა, რომელსაც ჩვენ ვაყენებთ.
არის რა, დემოკრატიული პროცესია და გამოვიდეთ და გავაპროტესტოთ, რაც არ მოგწონს რა.
დღეს ქართველიერი გაბრაზდა, ქართველიერი გამოხატავს იმას, რომ ჩვენ არ ვეგუებით ავტორიტარებს, არ ვეგუებით პოლიტიკურ რეპრესიებს ოპოზიციის წინააღმდეგ და ჩვენი მშვიდობიანი კონსტიტუციური პროტესტით აუცილებლად დავასრულებთ ამ უკანონო ხელისუფლებას.
So Georgia, then, once a democratic trailblazer in the volatile region in political turmoil, a sharp reversal of fortune for a small post-Soviet state which has spent the better part of the past 2 decades aspiring to move closer to the West. Well, that's today's Global Grid with our international affairs commentator, Doug Herbert, who's joining me now. Doug, the developments in Georgia then confusing, to say the least, even to those already familiar with Georgian politics. Explain to us, first of all, how this crisis has got to this point, can you?
Stuart, I will, and I will do so without having to say all of the names, which are really impossible to pronounce. So I'll take you through it. Look, it's a hot mess politically right now in Georgia. And if you want to trace it back to sort of some breaking point, it's last October when there were parliamentary elections held, elections which were won. Well, actually, the ruling party called Georgia Dream consolidated its gains from a year earlier in those elections. The opposition cried foul, not just cried foul, but they refused to sit in the new parliament. They said they were boycotting it. They said there were irregularities, fraud, even though international observers who had seen the election said that basically, more or less, they were free and fair. So you've had this sort of non-parliament sitting, the opposition not in parliament. Now let's fast forward to the events you just described this week. The leader of that opposition party that has refused to sit in the parliament since last October basically was arrested. Police raided the headquarters of his ruling party. It's called the United National Movement, as protesters gathered outside. Now, why did they arrest him? Well, his arrest actually stems on charges. Let's get more confusing here. Charges going back to 2019, the summer, when he and his party and supporters were all protesting already in the streets on a totally different matter, but there was a lot of animus already towards the Georgia Dream ruling party and the government. So he's arrested. Now, before that, last week, before his arrest, when a court had ordered his arrest, but before he was actually taken into custody, the prime minister of the country, Georgia's prime minister, a member of the ruling party, not the opposition party, said, I'm resigning, stepping down. Why did he say that, Stuart? Because basically he said that he believed that arresting the opposition leader, while he may not agree with him, would be extremely polarizing at a very vulnerable time for Georgia in its politics. So you then had him replaced, the prime minister, the one who resigned, by a new prime minister of the ruling party, who is very cozy with a Georgian billionaire who founded the party, who made his money, guess where? His fortune? In Russia. There are a lot of elements here, Stuart, and I just sort of scratched the surface there for you.
I'm glad you did and explained it to us because, as you said, it's very, very complicated. But hang on a minute, though, Doug. I mean, Georgia's reputation here not so long ago as a reforming country trying to get closer to the West. Where does it leave that?
Yeah, and Stuart, listen, it's not all out the window. Georgia still made very impressive gains since its so-called 2003 revolution under Saakashvili. You might remember Saakashvili. He was a lawyer. He was U.S. educated, very slick and smooth. He sort of was a trailblazer on the reform front, you know, at least in terms of security and policing and the army reforms and civil society. He wasn't as good on judicial reforms. Saakashvili fell onto hard times about 5 years after he came to power. He was a darling of the West. This was a time when everyone was talking about Georgia, rapprochement with NATO, the EU. It was seen as coming closer to the West. And all of a sudden, what happens? 2008, Russia invades. Russia invades and occupies two breakaway regions of Georgia, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, taking basically a fifth of Georgia's territory. They're still there today. Saakashvili held on another 4 years. He was out. Georgia Dream Party comes to power. Since then, Georgia, in the view of a lot of democracy observers, international observers, has slipped slightly in its democracy ratings. It's now what some call a hybrid regime. And the reason for that is not because it doesn't have democratic aspirations anymore, but it's sort of slipped up a little bit on the judicial and electoral reform, hence a lot of the problems we're seeing now.
Doug, we've had a pretty strong Western reaction to all of this. Is that likely, do you think, to influence the government's next steps there?
You know, it's really interesting. The influence, I don't know if we can actually bring it up to the screen, but the U.S. Embassy had one of the sort of harshest statements, perhaps. They issued it through their embassy in Tbilisi in the capital, and my eyes diverted because I'm reading some of that text, but your readers can see it on the screen. And the main takeaway from that is we regret that the call of the United States and other international partners for restraint and dialogue was ignored. We're dismayed by the polarizing rhetoric from Georgia's leadership at a time of crisis. Force and aggression are not the solution to resolving Georgia's political differences, and basically ending Georgia's moved backwards on its path towards becoming a stronger democracy. Those are really strong words from a country that has been a very solid partner of Georgia, and it's really a shot across the bow of the current political leadership saying, get your act together. Now, look, Georgia, like I said earlier, the Western reaction has been harsh, has been very strong, and a little bit surprised as well. And I think that the West wants to see Georgia come back into the fold. Georgia is very, very sensitive to the reaction to what's going on at home from the West. It may not have expected such a strong reaction. My sense is that even if the Georgian parties themselves are too much at loggerheads to work things out among themselves, perhaps there is a window here for international mediation for either the U.S. or the EU to step in some role and to try to hammer out a resolution between these two sides that cannot see eye to eye in any way. But I wouldn't give up on Georgia. They are a country that has proven very resilient in the past and very much inclined towards reforms, towards democratic-style governance. So keep your eye on this space, but it is right now very, very messy in Georgia, and we really don't know what the exact next step will be. Whether or not they release the opposition leader, whether there's a new election for parliament, who knows? But watch the space. We'll be coming back to this, I guarantee you, in the next days and weeks.
I'm sure we will. Doug, thanks very much. Doug Herbert, international affairs commentator, joining us for today's Global Grid there. Now, from Global Grid, we go on to today's Focus report and rewards for turning in poachers. Now, it's the unusual new approach that's been adopted by French animal welfare organisations to try and stop people from shooting protected species like lynx and even bears. Now, people are being offered up to €50,000 to provide information. But what do local people think in those areas? Well, they're very divided on the initiative, as we find out now. In this report, here's Wassim Cornet.
It was off this forest path that Gilles Moine made a sad discovery on December 30th after a tip-off from a hiker. The body of a lynx, the animal he's been monitoring for over 30 years.
He was over there among the dead branches. Between the first time we saw him and the next day when I came back with the OFB, he'd already been partially eaten by foxes. If we hadn't found him when we did, we'd never have known because all traces of him would have disappeared.
He filmed the lynx's body as proof, with the gaping hole in its stomach clearly visible. After an autopsy, authorities concluded that it had died of gunshot wounds, one death too many for this wildlife defender.
It was completely avoidable because it was a deliberate act by a person who wants to wipe the lynx off the map, or at least from this area, and that's no longer acceptable.
A judicial investigation has been opened, but Gilles Moine has little hope for it, as he says they rarely succeed. He decided instead to put out a call for witnesses, offering €1,000 for any information that could help find the poacher.
Denouncing a crime is not shameful. It's a civic act that helps to ensure that our country's rules are respected, in everyone's interest.
But not everyone in the region agrees with the idea of a reward, which has gone up to €5,000 thanks to private donations. Local hunters, for one, are mistrustful.
There's something distasteful about this financial incentive. Poaching has always been associated with hunting, whether we like it or not. It's a hunter who doesn't respect the rules.
And even rewards don't seem to be able to break the code of silence which reigns here and in Ariège in southern France. This valley may seem tranquil, but it's been at the center of a stir since the discovery of a dead bear, riddled with gunshot wounds. It's an illegal act, but one that doesn't shock everyone in the mountains.
Il y a une partie plus de neige. Il est là-haut. Il a été tué là-haut.
Et vous, ça vous fait pas d'émotion particulière qui
Ah non, ils peuvent en tuer 20 ou 30. Moi, ça m'est égal. Au contraire, je suis content. Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire, ça? Mettre des bêtes qui tuent les autres.
An NGO called Sea Shepherd has been offering €50,000 for information, but so far no one has come forward, a fact welcomed by this farmer whose sheep have been attacked by bears for the last 4 years.
The fact they've said nothing despite the enormous sum shows mountain solidarity, which I think is unfailing when it comes to this.
Reward schemes have worked in other parts of the country, though, like on the coast of Brittany, where 2 seals were found decapitated in 2019. Sea Shepherd had offered €10,000 for information leading to the identification of 2 fishermen who faced justice last year. They claimed they weren't fishing illegally.
All the seals were dead, all of them. We threw them back in the sea. My boss should have made a declaration, and he should have told me, "No, David, those are protected. We're not allowed to take these dead animals."
The fishermen were slapped with a €1,500 fine. Illegally killing an endangered animal is punishable by a €150,000 fine and 3 years in prison. Although humans aren't at the top of the food chain, they still act like they are.
That's today's Focus report for you, the very latest news. Eve Irvine will be here with you after the break. Don't go away.
Fake news. Noun. False stories that appear to be news, spread on the internet or using other media. At France 24, our job is to provide you with information that's been verified. We check sources, we check facts, we sort what is true from what is fake.
At the France 24 Observers, we verify photos and videos circulating online. If they're fake, we let you know and tell you how we spotted them.
In Fact or Fake, we dig into viral stories around Europe to shake out the truth from the trash.
Every day, the Info Migrants team scours social networks to fight fake news about the reality of migration.
France 24, news based on facts.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.
Sur France 24, la nuit, on est très fiers d'accompagner les Amériques dans leurs soirées, de voir l'Asie se réveiller, et on est là jusqu'à ce que Paris s'éveille.
In Live from Paris, our correspondents around the world keep you up to date.
من الطبيعي أن يكون شعارها الحرية وخاصة حرية التعبير في بلد حرية التعبير.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.
No masks, no lockdown. Restaurants and schools still open. In response to the coronavirus pandemic, the Swedish government is counting on the self-discipline of its people. But with 10 times more deaths than its Scandinavian neighbors, Sweden is under fire from critics. Was it right to protect the economy at any price? And were the authorities aiming for collective immunity?
La Suède, c'était le monde des bisounours, c'est qu'en fait, chacun pouvait sortir, chacun pouvait travailler, il n'y avait absolument rien. Donc du coup, en fait, les pays scandinaves, ils ont fermé carrément leurs frontières avec la Suède.
Our reporters have been to Sweden, Finland, and Denmark to try to understand their differences and meet the Swedes who have left because they feared catching the virus.
Reporters, presented by Mark Owen on France 24 and France24.com.
Hello and a very warm welcome to you. You're watching live from Paris here on France 24. These are our top stories this hour. A multi-ethnic rally being held in Myanmar, locals continuing to protest against the military coup despite threats to their lives. They remain defiant and were even dancing through the streets as they banged their drums, calling once again for the release of Aung San Suu Kyi. This as Myanmar's foreign minister has arrived in Thailand for diplomatic talks. France 24's Cyril Payan will be putting that in context for us. The first case in the world looking at state-sponsored torture by the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad is due to deliver its verdict. A former colonel is accused of being an accomplice to crimes against humanity. The case heard in Germany. We'll be getting the latest from our correspondent Nick Spicer in this edition. And basketball, or rather US-Canada relations, the two sides saying that they are closer than ever as Joe Biden and Justin Trudeau meet virtually for their first bilateral meeting. Good to have you with us. Well, also coming up this hour, America's flight regulator orders new inspections of Boeing aircraft engines after this weekend's mid-flight failure over Denver. We'll be looking at the latest details in our business update. A multi-ethnic rally taking place in Myanmar, protests continuing this week despite warnings from authorities that confrontation could get people killed. Indeed, it was an upbeat scene from the streets of the country's biggest city this Wednesday, drums being banned and demonstrators dancing through the streets. Well, joining us now is France 24's international reporter Cyril Payan. Cyril, you lived in Burma, Myanmar for many years, and so following this perhaps closely, more closely than many. Start with these protests, maybe. Like, we're still seeing very huge numbers on the streets,
which is very impressive regarding the level of people in charge. You have a military, a huge force with the huge weaponry. We're talking about a 400,000 strong army, and in front you have young people. But many generations on all fields on Monday, which was something very amazingly followed in all the country, with the enterprises, shops closed, millions of people flocked into the street. It didn't stop. There have been 3 weeks now since the junta took the power, and these people with no weapons are just standing and appealing for the international community to move in, which is not really delivering. But they really understand that they have been stolen this momentum of democracy that they had for a few years, since 2011. And even they are 17 years old, we understand that they did understand themselves that if they don't take the chance now, it will be gone forever.
Okay, so a largely youth-driven movement there. Of course, they're anti, this military junta that was angry really over the election results last November when the party of Aung San Suu Kyi won by a landslide. I mean, we're now hearing that a parallel democracy is being formed. Tell us
This
more.
is the CRPH, and this is extremely difficult because it's an underground movement which is starting, which is dominated by National League for Democracy MPs, elected MPs. Some of them have been in jail, for instance, for years. Though these are veterans of the fights for democracy, and dozens of them have been reunited under this committee, which is namely the CRPH, and they're trying to move on domestically on the social networks. We can see a lot of announcements, statements in the nationwide, but they also starting to move internationally to put pressure. For instance, on Monday, they did elect Dr. Sasa, which is a very renowned intellectual in Burma, Myanmar, to be their representative, their parallel or alternative representative at the United Nations, to pressure the United Nations. So they move on. The problem, sadly, is no news story, because in the 1990s, when Aung San Suu Kyi was under house arrest, it did happen already. They were a government in exile. So the problem, are we doing the same scenario? Not very much so, because now the difference is the social networks. When they have internet, these youngsters, these people in the street are sending footages, videos, and pictures all over the world. The problem is the internet is cut for 1 week now every night. But when they have the chance, they take the window of opportunity. So there is these two scenarios who makes a big difference with let's say 10 years ago. And this is how maybe the military in some point miscalculated.
Yeah, really feeling pressure, or the protesters putting pressure on a variety of different levels. Cyril, what do you make that we heard that Myanmar's foreign minister has arrived in Thailand for diplomatic talks? We had heard that the Indonesian foreign minister was also headed there, having cancelled a trip to Myanmar.
Well, we can wonder what kind of advices a military government can ask to another military government in Bangkok, because I think the protesters they know very well, because they are protesting now in front of the Indonesian embassy in Rangoon, in Yangon, saying ASEAN, as the Southeast Asia Association, would not interfere. This is one of the key principles, so they don't expect much from Thailand. Indonesia is maybe a new democracy, but it's very alone in this 10 nations association. So they really want to have a wider international pressure. Maybe they are just focusing on the new Biden administration in America, maybe the EU, let's say, or Australia, why not? But it's getting very slow. It has been 3 weeks now since the coup, and nothing very much internationally has been done except some goodwills and talks and speeches.
Cyril Baum, thanks a lot for bringing us your analysis of that situation. Meanwhile, the first case in the world looking at state-sponsored torture by the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad is due to deliver its verdict. A former colonel is being accused of being an accomplice to crimes against humanity. The 44-year-old, the first of two defendants on trial, being tried in Germany on the principle of universal jurisdiction, which allows a foreign country to prosecute such crimes regardless of where they've been committed. We can cross now over to Berlin to speak to Nick Spicer. Nick, tell us more about who is on trial and what are we expecting in this case?
Well, there are two men on trial, and the verdict we're going to be hearing today concerns Iyad al-Harib. He was a sergeant major outside of the town of Douma, which is about 10 kilometers southeast of the Syrian capital, Damascus, and he's accused of rounding up some 30 people and sending them to a notorious prison called Unit 251, where the colonel you were referring to earlier, Anwar Aslan, is accused of torturing some 4,000 people and killing 53. The first verdict we'll hear will concern the sergeant major, and he faces charges of aiding and abetting crimes against humanity. He faces up to 10 years in jail for that. However, he did cooperate and provide some testimony in the trial, and that may actually help him when it comes to sentencing, if indeed he is found guilty.
Nick, this Syrian crimes being tried in Germany, remind us exactly how that came about.
Well, it is a first. I mean, Germany has used this principle of universal jurisdiction, where you can try nationals of a foreign state in your country if the tribunals in that country are unable to prosecute them, or if the people who have suffered from the crimes and the alleged criminals are on your territory. It's a legal invention that's about 20, 30 years old now. They've been working on it for Rwanda and the ex-Yugoslavia. What's new here is that there is a Syrian government, and normally this government of Syria is supposed to deal with this kind of thing. However, you are allowed to bring before the tribunals nationals of a country. So that is the first. What is interesting here is a number of things. This was made possible because, as you may remember, Angela Merkel opened the country's arms to around 1 million Syrians in 2015. So you had the torturers and the people who had been tortured crossing each other on the streets. And then another phenomenon was a man codenamed Caesar, who was a former forensics officer in the military who went to the United Nations with thousands of pictures of torture. They're part of the evidence. And there's an NGO here in Germany, finally, the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights, which has helped the victims come together and put this case together. So you have actually people who are civil parties to this suit who say they were tortured by the two men who are on trial. So all of this is a first. It's significant for the victims most of all. They say themselves, finally they feel like they're being heard. Most people recognize it probably has little chance of changing the way the Syrian government is governing, waging the war and treating its people. And then there is also the question of whether or not this will dissuade people who are thinking of leaving the government and going into the opposition from doing so. But it is a first, and it is definitely of some solace to the victims that things have got this far already.
Nick, thanks very much indeed for that. Nick Spicer there, our correspondent in Berlin. Now, they were forced to keep their distance physically, but were wont to press the fact that their relationship was as close as could be. US President Joe Biden and Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau held their first bilateral meeting, climate change topping the agenda. Trudeau thanking Biden for re-signing the US up to the Paris Climate Agreement, and the pair pledged to work together towards net zero emissions by 2050.
Behind masks and in separate conference rooms, there was little pomp and ceremony for Joe Biden's virtual conference with Justin Trudeau, the U.S. president's first meeting with a foreign leader since taking office. On the agenda, solidifying a united front to tackle shared challenges, including climate change, continental security, relations with China, and the coronavirus pandemic.
Job one remains keeping people safe and ending this pandemic. This afternoon, the President and I discussed collaboration to beat COVID-19, from keeping key supplies moving and supporting science and research to joint efforts through international institutions. We're standing united in this fight.
After 4 years of tension under Donald Trump, both leaders hailed a return to normal relations between the historically close allies. In one of the biggest breaks with the Trump administration, Biden and Trudeau announced a closer alliance to combat climate change now that the United States has rejoined the Paris Climate Agreement.
To that end, we're launching a high-level climate ambition ministerial, and to align our policies and our goals, and to achieve net zero emissions by 2050.
President Biden also pushed for closer cooperation with Canada in order to better counter Beijing, with the U.S. president reiterating calls for Chinese authorities to free 2 Canadians detained there. And with both leaders emphasizing reinvigorated relations between the two countries, they avoided mentioning any points of tension. Among them, Joe Biden's promise to block the Keystone XL pipeline, which would have transported crude oil from Canada to the United States.
We're also focusing on climate change. The UN Security Council renewed calls for urgent action. The group saying that the warming of the planet, one of the greatest threats to peace. The summit is being hosted this month by the UK. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson telling attendees that they needed to all act fast to reduce emissions. Catherine Viette has more.
A special session of the UN Security Council. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has made an urgent plea to reduce